You've lived here for years. Every corner is familiar. But one night, as you make your way down the hallway, you notice it. A door. It wasn't there before. You reach out, the handle cold under your fingers, and as it opens, you step into a room that shouldn't exist. The walls are covered with photos of you. Every moment, every expression. But something is wrong. In each picture, there's a shadow right behind you. In a town so quiet, it feels like time itself has slowed. Sits an old Victorian house at the edge of the woods. It's been there longer than anyone can remember, older than the town itself, or so people say. Generations of the same family have lived and died within these walls, each leaving behind traces of their lives. Their memories linger like dust in the air, unseen but impossible to shake. You can feel it the moment you step inside, as though the house is watching, waiting. The floors groan with every step, shifting beneath your weight as if testing your presence, as if remembering footsteps from years ago. The smell is thick, a blend of must and age, like a library left untouched for centuries. In every corner, shadows pool and stretch, darker than the night outside, filling every crevice as though hiding secrets that refuse to fade. And then there are the drafts, slipping through cracks in the walls and doors, brushing against you like a hand reaching from the past. They bring with them faint smells, a hint of perfume, a whiff of smoke from a fire long extinguished, memories lingering in the very bones of the house. The walls are lined with old, framed photos, faces faded with time, staring out at nothing, or maybe watching something that isn't there anymore. Faces of ancestors whose names are half remembered, their expressions blank, hollow, as though they too are trapped here, waiting for something. Late at night, when the house is still and the world outside has gone silent, you can hear sounds, faint echoes from rooms thought to be empty. The soft creak of floorboards as though someone's pacing back and forth, footsteps where no one walks, and whispers, not words exactly, but the low murmur of voices, just on the edge of hearing, like secrets shared in the dark. It's a place where the past clings to you, where the walls seem to breathe, as though alive with something more than memories. It's a house that doesn't just hold secrets, it keeps them, tucked away in every dark corner, woven into the fabric of the wood and stone, hidden in the silence that falls heavy as soon as you step inside. And as you walk from room to room, you start to feel it, that you're never really alone here. The kind of place where history doesn't rest, it waits. It was the kind of quiet that pressed against your skin, a silence that didn't just fill the air but wrapped around it, thick and suffocating. Every night, as the house settled into darkness, the silence would deepen, stretching out, swallowing even the faintest sounds. Lying in bed, the protagonist would close their eyes, but sleep wouldn't come, not easily, because just beyond the silence, faint sounds drifted, whispers. Not the words of a conversation, but more like the fragmented echoes of secrets shared long ago, secrets slipping down the hallway, barely more than a murmur. And each night, the whispers grew a little louder, moving closer, as if whatever was speaking knew it was being listened to. At first, they tried to ignore it, brushing it off as the creaks and groans of an old house settling in. But there was something about these sounds, something too deliberate, too alive. They'd lie there, still, barely breathing, straining to hear. And then, just when they were certain someone or something was there, the whispers would fall silent, leaving only the weight of dread in their place. Then came the shadows. They began as nothing more than the play of moonlight on walls, faint shapes that seemed harmless. But soon the shadows started to move, slipping through rooms in ways shadows shouldn't. One moment, they'd be there, stretching long across the floor, and in the next, they'd vanish, reappearing just on the edge of vision, always just out of reach. These shadows were no trick of the light. They felt alive, carrying with them a sense of being watched, of something waiting just beyond sight, ready to reveal itself if only they'd let their guard down. And then, small things began to change. A book left on the bedside table found its way to the kitchen. A drawer once shut, left open just an inch, its contents disturbed. The protagonists told themselves they were just being forgetful, that they'd simply misplaced things. But deep down, a sense of unease took root, something they couldn't shake. Objects moved when no one was watching, rearranged as if by unseen hands. It was as if the house itself were playing tricks, bending reality in ways that seemed small at first but impossible to ignore. People in town had spoken about this place, though never in the full light of day. Rumors clung to it like the ivy winding up its crumbling walls. They told stories of a young woman who had once lived there, a woman who had vanished one cold winter night, her fate unknown but never forgotten. The town's older residents would whisper about her, lowering their voices as if she might be listening. Some claimed to have seen her late at night, a figure glimpsed from the corner of the eye, only to disappear as quickly as she'd come. Others spoke of the cries they'd heard while passing by, faint but unmistakable, as though the walls themselves were mourning. As the nights stretched on, the protagonist found it harder to dismiss the rumors, harder to pretend they were alone in that house. There were moments when they'd walk down the hallway, and the air would change, growing thick, almost heavy, as if someone were standing right behind them, close enough to touch. They'd stop, feeling the hairs on the back of their neck rise, every instinct urging them to run, yet unable to shake the sensation that, if they turned, they'd see someone watching from the shadows. But each time they turned, they found nothing, just empty air and that heavy, oppressive silence. Sleep became elusive, slipping from their grasp as the house grew more restless. They'd wake in the early hours, cold sweat on their skin, the whispers fading from their mind as though they'd been there only in the space between sleep and waking. But the fear remained, seeping deeper with every night, a growing certainty that the house wasn't just haunted by memories. It was alive with them, drawing its strength from their fear, from their uncertainty, feeding on their every glance over the shoulder, every quickened breath in the darkness. One night, they couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a flashlight, they walked through the empty rooms, the light casting long shadows that danced along the walls, the house seeming to breathe in the dark. And as they moved, that feeling of being watched intensified, pressing down on them, filling the air until it was almost too thick to breathe. Every step echoed, each creak of the floorboards a reminder of every story, every whispered warning, every shadow that had slipped through the house. The townsfolk had been right, they realized. This wasn't just a house with a history. It was a place that held on to its past, clinging to every memory, every life that had passed through its doors. And now it had them in its grasp. This was a house that kept secrets, secrets that waited in the dark, in the shadows, in the whispers that drifted through the halls. Secrets that were patient, knowing that one day they would be seen and heard. That night, as the house settled into its usual haunting silence, the protagonist wandered down the hallway, their steps heavy with fatigue and unease. The shadows seemed darker, thicker, as if watching and waiting for something. Then, they noticed it, a door at the far end of the hall, partially concealed by shadows, an old wooden door they had never seen before. They paused, eyes narrowing as they stared, a chill running down their spine. How could a door appear in a place they'd walked 100 times? Had it always been there, blending so seamlessly into the darkness that they had overlooked it, or had it somehow just appeared? Curiosity and dread tangled within them as they took a hesitant step forward, then another, each one echoing in the empty hall. They reached out, hand trembling as their fingers touched the door's rough surface, feeling the coolness of the wood seep into their skin. It felt ancient, like it had been waiting there, biding its time. A sense of wrongness washed over them, an instinct to turn and walk away, but something deeper, something irresistible, urged them forward. Taking a slow, unsteady breath, they tightened their grip on the cold metal handle and pushed. The door creaked open, and a wave of stale, musty air hit them, thick with the scent of old paper and forgotten things. The room beyond was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the floor and walls. They took a cautious step inside, their eyes adjusting to the gloom, and as they looked around, a strange familiarity crept over them. It was like stepping into a dream they couldn't quite remember. And then they noticed the objects scattered throughout the room, small, personal items that sent a jolt of recognition through them. Items that belonged to them, things they'd long since forgotten. A faded sweater they hadn't seen in years. A book they'd lost somewhere along the way, its pages yellowed with time. Little trinkets, tokens of their past, as if someone had been gathering fragments of their life and storing them here in this hidden room. They walked deeper into the room, heart pounding as they took in the details. Along the walls were photographs, dozens of them, all of the protagonists at various ages. In each photo, they were captured in mundane moments, reading, cooking, lost in thought, looking out a window. But these weren't just snapshots. They were too precise, too intimate. They were moments they didn't recall anyone capturing, private fragments of their life that should have remained unseen. And in each photo, there was something unsettling about their expression, a subtle but unmistakable strangeness in their eyes, as if they were looking into the lens, but not quite themselves. Their eyes traveled over the photos, a growing dread clawing at their chest as they began to realize what they were seeing. In the background of a few pictures, hidden in the shadows or reflected faintly in glass, there was a figure. A darkened form, barely more than a silhouette, standing just behind them. At first, it was barely noticeable, a smudge in the corner, a blur in the background. But as they examined each image, the figure became clearer, its presence more pronounced, lurking just out of reach, but always watching. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up as they took a shaky step back, unable to shake the feeling that this figure, this watcher, had been with them for a very long time. They could feel its gaze lingering, like cold fingers brushing over their skin, an awareness pressing down on them, making the room feel suddenly smaller, the air thicker. They felt their heart race, a heavy pulse echoing in their ears as the weight of the realization sank in. They had never been alone in this house. Every quiet night, every solitary moment, something had been there, hidden just out of sight, observing, waiting. Desperately, they scanned the room for any sign of movement, expecting to see the shadowy figure step out from behind the photos, to feel a cold breath on the back of their neck. But the room remained still, the silence stretching, pressing down on them with an almost physical weight. They backed toward the door, their breaths shallow, each step feeling as though it took twice the effort. Reaching for the handle, they turned to leave, the room blurring at the edges as a wave of nausea washed over them. But just before they crossed the threshold, a faint whisper brushed past their ear, so close they could almost feel the breath on their skin. It was a single word, barely more than a sigh. Stay. They stumbled back into the hallway, slamming the door shut, their chest tight with fear, fingers trembling as they gripped the handle, as if it alone could keep whatever lay within from escaping. They leaned against the wall, eyes wide, heart racing, trying to process what they'd just seen, what they'd just heard. But the feeling of being watched didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, an unshakable sense that eyes followed their every move, unseen yet undeniably present. The days that followed were worse. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward them, every quiet moment punctuated by faint, indistinct whispers that faded as soon as they tried to listen. Sleep became impossible. Every time they closed their eyes, they'd see those photos, feel that figure just out of reach, waiting. They'd lie awake, feeling the weight of invisible eyes pressing down, sensing movement in the corner of the room, a subtle shifting in the air. They tried to tell themselves it was just their imagination, that they'd somehow misunderstood what they'd seen. But deep down, they knew. They knew they weren't alone. The hidden room, those photos, the whispers, it was all a reminder that this presence had been with them, a silent witness to every private moment, every thought they believed was theirs alone. And now, it was letting itself be known, drawing them in, pushing them to uncover the truth it had guarded for so long. The house was no longer just a place to live. It was a trap, a maze of memories and shadows, each corner hiding something unseen, each hallway echoing with the soft footsteps that never quite kept pace. And as they moved through it, they could feel that presence, always just behind, watching with patient, unblinking eyes, waiting for them to understand the truth that had been lurking there all along. In the days that followed, the protagonists tried to convince themselves that everything could go back to normal. The mornings were always their chance to reclaim some sense of peace, some illusion of control. Each day, they'd rise slowly, deliberately, hoping that the light of dawn would erase the shadows of the night before. They went through the motions, clinging to routines, The familiar smell of brewing coffee, the steady ticking of the clock on the wall, the simple act of washing a dish, drying it, and setting it in its place. Every task was a small step toward feeling that everything was ordinary, that they were safe. They tried to shake off the heavy memories of the hidden room, the feeling of being watched, and the shadows that seemed to linger a little too long. But even in these moments, something felt off, like they were playing a part in a life that wasn't quite their own anymore. Yet the silence was never just silence. It stretched, lingered, felt too deep, too aware. As they sat in the kitchen, the usual hum of the refrigerator, the soft clinks and clatters of morning routines seemed to dissolve, leaving a stillness that settled around them, thick and unmoving. Occasionally, a noise would break the quiet, the distant, almost inaudible sound of a door creaking in another part of the house, the faint shuffle of something brushing against the walls, sounds that seemed to drift through the air like a warning. They told themselves it was the house settling, old wood creaking and groaning as it always had. But somewhere within, they knew this wasn't the same. This wasn't the comforting silence they'd known before. It felt alive, waiting, watching. Each night became harder. The air seemed colder, thicker, pressing down on them in a way that felt almost intentional. They'd lie in bed, pulling the covers up to their chin, eyes fixed on the ceiling, trying to drown out the sounds that drifted through the walls. But no matter how hard they tried, the noises persisted. The soft shuffling of footsteps outside their door, slow and deliberate, moving up and down the hall. They would lie there, frozen, barely daring to breathe, willing the sounds to stop, but they wouldn't. Each step was deliberate, echoing in the silence, as if someone was pacing outside their door, waiting for something. The next morning, they tried to laugh it off, telling themselves that maybe they'd imagined it, that maybe the mind plays tricks in the dark. They poured a cup of coffee, hoping the warmth would chase away the chill that seemed to have settled within them. But as they reached for the sugar bowl, their hand froze. The bowl wasn't where they had left it. It was slightly off, turned at an angle, just enough to be noticeable. They frowned, trying to remember if they'd moved it, but they were certain they hadn't. Shaking it off, they brushed it aside, forcing themselves to carry on, pretending that everything was fine, that they hadn't noticed. But it happened again. The next morning, the salt shaker was moved. Then a mug that they always kept on the counter was turned to face the opposite direction. Little things, each one small enough to ignore, but together they began to build, each one a reminder that something was off. That they were not alone in this house, not anymore. And then one night, as they lay in bed, they heard it, their own voice, drifting from somewhere in the house. At first, they thought they were dreaming, that the exhaustion had finally caught up with them, but the sound grew louder, clearer. It was unmistakable. Their own voice, faint but distinct, calling out from the darkness. They sat up, heart pounding, trying to make sense of it. Who could be speaking in their voice? Trembling, they climbed out of bed, pushing the door open just a crack, listening. The voice was coming from down the hall, echoing faintly through the darkness, as though someone was repeating something they'd said long ago, something they had forgotten. They took a step into the hallway, the sound drawing them forward, each step an effort as they followed the familiar but distorted voice. The air felt thick, heavy, each breath a struggle as they moved closer. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the voice fell silent, leaving only the soft hum of the house around them. A silence so complete it felt like the walls were holding their breath, waiting. The next day, they avoided the hall, avoiding any room with a mirror or a shadow that might move when they weren't looking. Instead, they focused on mundane tasks, anything to keep their mind occupied. They stood at the kitchen counter, chopping vegetables, focusing on the steady rhythm, the comforting sound of the knife against the cutting board. They told themselves that they were being ridiculous, that they were letting their imagination run wild. But just as they began to relax, the lights flickered. It was a small flicker, barely noticeable, but enough to stop them in their tracks. They glanced up, watching as the lights dimmed, flickered again, and then settled back to normal. They shook it off, telling themselves it was just an electrical issue, something to fix later. But deep down, they knew it wasn't just a flicker. It was a reminder, a small shift in the atmosphere that told them the house was aware of every thought, every fear. The flickering became more frequent, each time lasting just a little longer, casting the house in brief moments of shadow, as if testing their resolve. Sometimes it would happen as they brushed their teeth, the bathroom lights dimming until only their reflection remained, distorted in the mirror's faint glow. Other times it would happen as they sat in the living room, reading, the light shifting until shadows crept across the walls, reaching out as if they too were alive. And then the doors began to move. They'd sit alone in the kitchen, a cup of coffee warming their hands, and they'd hear it, a quiet click, followed by the creak of a door slowly swinging open in the other room. They'd freeze, listening, knowing that no one else could be there, yet unable to ignore the soft, deliberate sound of the door opening. And when they finally mustered the courage to look, they'd find it, an empty room, the door wide open, waiting. Each sound, each flicker, each door left ajar was a reminder that the house was not letting them ignore it, not anymore. They could feel its presence with them always, in every room, every quiet moment, waiting just out of sight. And no matter how hard they tried to go back to the comfort of their old routines, each calm moment shattered the instant they tried to believe in it. It was as though the house was feeding on their fear, on their attempts to cling to normalcy, drawing strength from each flicker of doubt, each glance over their shoulder. There was no more denying it. They weren't alone, and the house wanted them to know it. Each breath, each step, each beat of their heart felt claimed by something unseen, something that moved with them, watched them, and waited. And now they were certain of one thing: the house would never let them feel safe again. After days of dread and nights of restless sleep, the protagonists found themselves once again drawn to that hidden door, the one they had vowed never to open again. But something had changed. The house's strange occurrences had grown relentless, and the whispers in the walls now seemed to be pushing them toward the room, almost calling to them. Standing before the door, they hesitated, hand trembling on the handle, feeling a chill seep into their skin from the cold metal. The air was thick, pressing down around them, as if the entire house held its breath, watching, waiting for them to cross the threshold. Taking a shaky breath, they turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was barely recognizable. Where once there had been only a few scattered belongings, remnants of a forgotten past, the space was now filled from wall to wall with an array of objects, each one disturbingly familiar. Everywhere they looked, there were personal items from their life, pieces they hadn't seen in years. They were scattered across the floor, perched on shelves, stacked in corners. Clothes they had worn as a child, old diaries with pages torn and faded, broken toys they'd once treasured, letters they'd written but never sent. It was as though someone had been collecting pieces of them, curating a life's worth of memories in this hidden, forsaken room. A growing unease settled into the pit of their stomach as they scanned the room. Some of these items were things they distinctly remembered losing long ago. Others had vanished without explanation. There was an old necklace they thought they'd left behind at a friend's house as a child, an ancient keychain they'd given up looking for years ago, a tattered book they could have sworn had been discarded. They stepped closer to a shelf, running their fingers over the cover of an old journal that had belonged to them decades ago, its pages yellowed, crumbling at the edges. How had these things found their way here, to this place? It was as though every fragment of their life, every little thing they had once touched or loved, had been carefully preserved within these walls. And then their eyes fell on something in the center of the room, a mirror. Tall and ornate, with intricate carvings winding up its frame like vines, it seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Its glass was dark, almost as if it absorbed the dim light rather than reflecting it. They took a step closer, compelled yet dreading what they might see. As they moved, their reflection slowly emerged, hazy at first, like a shadow rising from deep water, until it finally became clear. They saw their own face, pale, exhausted, eyes hollowed by fear. But there was something wrong. The reflection's eyes sparkled with a cold gleam, its mouth turned up at the corners in a faint, mocking smile that didn't match the expression on their own face. It was as if the reflection had a life of its own, a consciousness that stretched beyond the glass, something that was not them. Heart pounding, they reached a trembling hand up to their face, feeling the coldness of their skin, watching as the reflection mirrored their movements with uncanny precision. But then the reflection's hand froze mid-air, hanging in a pose that should have been impossible, while the protagonist's own hand dropped to their side. Their breath hitched as the reflection's smirk widened, the smile stretching just a little too far, the edges of its mouth curling upward in a way that seemed unnatural, inhuman. Then, without warning, the reflection leaned closer to the glass, pressing both hands against it, palms flat, eyes wide and unblinking. It stared directly into their soul, the smirk deepening as if it were savoring a private joke, something only it understood. The protagonist stumbled back, feeling the walls closing in, but the reflection didn't move. It just stood there, staring, hands splayed against the glass, fingers curling ever so slightly as though testing the barrier, as though it could feel the thin separation between them, the flimsy divide keeping it locked away. And then, in a voice so soft it was barely more than a whisper, the reflection spoke. The sound was chilling, hollow, like a faint echo bouncing off the walls of an empty room. It used their voice, but it was wrong somehow, twisted, distorted, filled with an emptiness that made every word sound like a dark promise. "I've watched you," it said, the words hanging in the air like a shroud. "I've learned you, every movement, every thought, and now," it paused, a smile breaking into a grin that stretched far beyond any human expression. "Now it's my turn." A wave of realization washed over them, each word sinking like stones in a deep, dark well. This entity, this thing, had been there all along, hidden in the shadows, imitating them, learning from them, waiting. The whispers, the shadows, the unexplained flickers of light, they were all pieces of a plan, parts of a slow, methodical process through which it had come to know them in every way possible. It had been preparing, step by step, collecting fragments of their life, every memory, every tiny detail, until it was ready to take their place. Panicking, they stumbled back, away from the mirror, but the reflection only watched, eyes bright, mouth twisted into a mockery of their own fear. As they reached the door, their heart raced with the urge to run, to escape the horror unfolding before them. But just as they turned the handle, the reflection's hand raised in a slow, taunting wave, and from its lips came a laugh, quiet, but unmistakably familiar, their own laugh, warped and hollow, echoing through the empty room. The sound filled their ears, seeping into every crevice of the house, as if it were spreading, reaching beyond the mirror's frame, slipping into every shadowed corner, every darkened hallway. Desperate, they turned to flee, feeling that terrible laugh following them down the hall, echoing off the walls, each step a reminder that the house held no refuge from the thing that wore their face. As they reached the end of the hallway, they could still feel it, like a dark presence clinging to the air, a shadow that would never leave, that had no intention of letting them go. And in that moment, a terrible thought took hold. The reflection, that twisted version of themselves, was still there, watching, waiting, and wherever they went, whatever they did, it would follow, always one step behind, always ready to take what it believed was rightfully its own. The moment they fled from that house, they told themselves it was over. They walked down the darkened road, feeling the cold night air wrap around them, the distant stars watching in silent indifference. Every step took them farther from that place, from the hidden room and the twisted reflection that had stared at them from the glass. Their only thought was to leave it all behind, to escape the weight of that darkness. But even as they put miles between themselves and the house, they couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed. They forced the thought away, telling themselves that it was all in their mind, that the horror would stay confined to that place, bound to the shadows of the house they would never return to. In the days that followed, life returned to something close to normal, or at least that's what they tried to convince themselves. They returned to their routines, to the familiar spaces and sounds of everyday life. They worked, laughed, tried to reattach themselves to the comfort of ordinary things, and for a while it seemed as if they might succeed. They could almost believe that everything that had happened in that house was nothing more than a nightmare, a memory that would eventually fade like a bad dream. But soon, the feeling began to creep back. It was subtle at first, a fleeting sense of unease that would pass as quickly as it came. Walking down a crowded street, they'd feel a sudden prickling on the back of their neck, a sensation of being watched. They'd turn, expecting to see someone there, but there would be only strangers, each of them oblivious, each face unfamiliar. They tried to laugh it off, telling themselves it was just paranoia, a residual effect of everything they'd been through. But the feeling lingered, a subtle weight that followed them, always just out of reach, like a shadow clinging to their heels. Then, one quiet evening, they heard it, the whispers, soft, barely audible, drifting through the stillness of their empty apartment. They froze, listening, heart pounding as they strained to catch the words. But the whispers were too faint, just a murmur on the edge of hearing, dissolving into silence as soon as they tried to focus on them. They searched every room, every corner, every darkened hallway, but there was no one there. Just them, standing alone in the quiet, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of air, a reminder of the presence they thought they'd left behind. The days turned into weeks, but the feeling only grew stronger. They began to notice shadows where there should be none, flickers of movement in the corner of their eye. Every reflective surface became something to avoid, the faintest glimpse of their own face, a reminder of the twisted reflection that had once stared back at them with a knowing smile. They tried to ignore it, to convince themselves that it was nothing more than a lingering fear, a memory that would fade with time. But the feeling persisted, an invisible presence that clung to their every step, a silent observer lurking just beyond their reach. One evening, as they sat in their living room, trying to lose themselves in the hum of the television, they caught a glimpse of something in the glass of the window, a shadowy figure standing behind them. They turned quickly, heart racing, but there was no one there, only the empty room, silent and still. They stared at the glass, watching their own reflection, waiting for it to move, to smile, to break through the fragile boundary between them. But the reflection remained still, their own face staring back, pale and wide-eyed, a mirror image of the fear that had rooted itself within them. Nights became the hardest. Sleep slipped away, replaced by a constant, nagging sense of dread that weighed down on them like a dark cloud. They'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the air grow thick around them, heavy with an invisible presence. Sometimes, just as they were on the edge of sleep, they'd hear a faint sound, a quiet laugh, their own voice, drifting from somewhere in the shadows. They'd sit up, listening, heart pounding, but the silence would stretch out, filling the room like a living thing, pressing down until they could barely breathe. Then came the mirrors. They had avoided them at first, afraid of what they might see, but as time passed, they found themselves drawn to them, compelled by a strange, irrational need to know. Standing before the bathroom mirror one night, they looked at their own reflection, studying every detail, every line, every shadow. For a moment, everything seemed normal, just their own face, tired and pale, staring back at them. But then, just as they were about to turn away, something shifted. The face in the mirror didn't move, didn't blink. It just stared, its eyes widening ever so slightly, a glimmer of something dark and knowing flickering within them. They backed away, heart pounding, telling themselves it was nothing, that it was all in their mind. But the fear had taken root, growing deeper with each passing day, an invisible shadow stretching over every part of their life. They began to see it everywhere, in the faces of strangers on the street, in the faintest of reflections in store windows, in the dark corners of their own home. The presence they thought they'd left behind was with them, embedded in every shadow, every quiet moment, a silent observer that refused to let go. And so they carried on, haunted by the question that gnawed at the edges of their mind. Was it still there, watching, waiting for its moment? Or had it moved on, slipping through the cracks of the mirror, finding someone else to haunt? They told themselves it was over, that they were free, but every whisper, every shadow, every flicker of movement told a different story. Now each time they catch their own reflection, they hesitate, searching for any sign of that twisted grin, that mocking smile that had once stared back at them from the depths of the hidden room. Because deep down, they know, It's only a matter of time before it returns, before the presence that once lurked in the darkness reaches out again. And in the quiet hours of the night, when they feel the weight of unseen eyes pressing down, they wonder, what would happen if they looked into the mirror just a little too long? Would it still be there, waiting, watching? Or has it already found someone else, moving silently through shadows, slipping into another life, another reflection, ready to take its place once more? Thank you for staying with us, but before you go, let's linger on this story a bit longer. Imagine yourself standing in your own home, your sanctuary, and you discover a door you've never seen before. What would you do if you felt something on the other side calling you? Something that had been waiting in the shadows, watching, knowing every small detail of your life. Would you open that door, or would you leave it, always wondering what might have been hiding behind it, perhaps hiding as you? And then, think about this. Do you believe that spirits, entities, or something else could be learning from us, silently observing, memorizing each habit, every expression, waiting until they're ready to take our place? Is it possible that reflections aren't as innocent as they seem, that shadows don't always stay where they belong? Have you ever had a moment where you caught a glimpse of yourself in a mirror and felt like, for just a second, it wasn't quite you? Or maybe you felt it in your own home, an awareness, an unsettling presence when you thought you were alone, a shadow that moved just a little too independently, or whispers that didn't quite disappear. Share your stories with us in the comments below. Tell us about that eerie night when something didn't feel quite right, or that time when you looked at a reflection and felt it was watching back, studying you just a little too closely. We want to know your haunting details, the ones that still send chills down your spine and linger in the back of your mind. If this story left you feeling unsettled, curious, or maybe even questioning what's real, be sure to hit that subscribe button. This is just one of many tales we have to share with you, tales that will reach into the darkest corners of your imagination, stories of haunted places, souls that can't move on, and the strange mysteries that surround us all. Our upcoming stories will lead you to forgotten places, introduce you to shadows that have minds of their own, and whisper secrets that refuse to stay buried. So, if you're ready to journey deeper into the unknown, if you crave stories that keep you looking over your shoulder, subscribe, like, and hit that notification bell. Each new story will bring you face to face with things most people avoid, tales that will keep you wide awake, questioning the quietness around you. And remember, the next time you catch a flicker of movement in the corner of your eye or a whisper that seems to come from nowhere, maybe, just maybe, you're not imagining it. Perhaps something is watching, and it's much closer than you think.